an invasive species. Not all animals are welcome. Sometimes the presence of a species can mean problems for the ecological well-being of an environment. What are some of the most invasive species on Earth? Keep watching to find out. 18. Floridian Burmese python. There's no mistaking the Burmese python when you see it. It is one of the 5 largest snakes in the world, measuring at an average 12.1 feet or 3.7 meters long, though larger specimen can grow to 18.8 feet or 5.74 meters. They are native to the grasslands, swamps, and jungles of South and Southeast Asia. Do you know where they're not native to? Florida. Do you know what Florida has? Swamps galore. Over 1,300 pythons have been captured in the Everglades, with more than 300 sightings between 2008 and 2010. There have been many movements to reduce the python population in Florida. In 2013, the state held a python challenge wherein they awarded prizes to those that captured the most snakes. 17. The rise of the lionfish. The turkeyfish, zebrafish, or butterfly cod, those are all different names for one animal, most commonly known as the lionfish. You can't miss them as they have very noticeable coloring and patterns. Their appearance serves as a warning to other animals to not come near lest they want a healthy dose of venom. The lionfish is a small creature, measuring between 2 to 17.7 inches or 5 to 45 centimeters, depending on the species. Lionfish are native to tropical and subtropical regions from southern Japan and Korea to the east coast of Australia, Micronesia, and Indonesia. Around the 1990s, the lionfish was introduced to the coast of Florida. Since then, they have become an invasive species to the United States East Coast and the Caribbean. 16. The striped stowaways. The next striped invasive species we're going to talk about is the zebra mussel. They measure 2 inches or 5.1 centimeters at the largest, but most only grow no bigger than your fingernail. Their shells are incredibly sharp, so if you see any, watch where you step because they could slice your foot. This freshwater creature is native to the lakes of Ukraine and southern Russia. In the 1980s, they invaded North America's Great Lakes and Hudson River and have thrived ever since. 15. The squirrel in the east. You probably guessed squirrels would make it on a list like this. The eastern gray squirrel is native to eastern North America. There, they are essential to the ecosystem due to their food hoarding. They help spread seeds around the soil, causing natural forest regeneration. These squirrels take their caches of food and bury them for later use. Because they have very accurate spatial memory, they can recover their caches months later with ease. In Europe, they were introduced, and the gray squirrel is considered an invasive species. In Britain, they've even displaced the native red squirrel. 14. The American iguana. The green iguana, also called the American iguana, is native to South America. You will find them living as far down as Paraguay and southern Brazil, up to Mexico and the Caribbean islands. You can also find them in Puerto Rico, where they are known as the bamboo chicken. If they live in so many places, where are they invasive to? Like the Burmese python, the green iguana has taken over Florida. These lizards are primarily herbivores and prefer foods like turnips, flowers, fruit, and greens, so they don't pose too much of a threat to other animals. However, their large populations in Florida has caused a lot of damage to infrastructure, such as sidewalks and seawalls. 13. The swamp rat. If you're already not a fan of rats, then the thought of one in a swamp probably sounds very unappealing to you. You probably wouldn't have guessed that its name is the nutria. This rodent is also known as the coipu and is part of a family of spiny rats. They are native to South America, but now even live in North America, Asia, Europe, and Africa because of fur traders introducing them to new regions. The United States considers nutrias an invasive species. Sure, they eat weeds and overabundant vegetation, but they also destroy many crops and disrupt aquatic vegetation. 12. The feral swine. Pigs don't only live on farms. There are several types of pigs that live in the wilderness all over the world. Feral swine may also be referred to as wild hogs, Russian or Eurasian boars, or razorbacks. Do not mistake these for the gentle swine found at petting zoos. Wild hogs can be ferocious. Early explorers brought feral pigs to North America during the 1500s and used them as a source of food. Bringing them over from Europe continued for many years. The feral pigs we see roaming around today are the descendants of escaped individuals from those early years. The population is so large and out of control that hunting wild boar is highly encouraged in the US. 11. The Eurasian collared dove. You're used to seeing pigeons everywhere, but their cousin, the Eurasian collared dove, is also considered an invasive species. This dove is native to Europe and Asia, but was introduced to North America accidentally. In 1974, about 50 doves escaped captivity in New Providence, Bahamas. From there, they quickly spread to Florida and can now be found in all states and even Mexico. They look harmless, but Eurasian collared doves are an aggressive competitor for food sources, ultimately outcompeting native birds. 10. Giant and poisonous. The cane toad, or the giant neotropical toad, is the largest toad in the world. It is native to mainland Central America and South America. However, they were introduced to northern Australia and different islands in the Caribbean and Oceania. This amphibian has been around for a long time. When scientists found the fossil of a cane toad, they discovered its DNA was indistinguishable from modern cane toads. While the cane toad is used as pest control in the Caribbean and Pacific Islands, they are considered an invasive species in Australia. The street rat. This rat goes by a few names: the common rat, the water rat, Parisian rat, and sewer rat. However, most people know these little guys as the Norway rat. Even though this rodent has multiple predators, they still run rampant in places like the US. Despite its name being the Norway rat, scientists guess its origins are somewhere in the plains of Asia, between northern China and Mongolia. In the Middle Ages, the Norway rat spread to different parts of the world. 8. Vulnerable invaders. The Asian carp, also known as the European carp or common carp, is native to Europe and Asia. According to the IUCN, the indigenous populations in these areas are vulnerable to extinction. Strangely enough, the Asian carp thrives in other parts of the world where they were introduced. These carp are on the list of the 100 worst invasive species, with Australia receiving the brunt of their negative impact. Asian carp damage the native fish populations that live in lakes and rivers, since they outcompete them for food and space. In addition to spreading to other areas via humans, carp are also skilled jumpers and can leap over barriers like low dams. 7. More snake than fish. The next fish on our list is the northern snakehead. Native to China, North Korea, South Korea, and Russia, this fish was not introduced to other areas until the 20th century. The first report of this species in Europe was in the 1950s. The northern snakehead wasn't considered an invasive species until 2002. They aren't mere goldfish either. The snakehead fish can reach lengths of up to 4 feet 11 inches or 150 centimeters. They have a unique respiratory system which allows them to live out of water for several days. 6. Rabbits everywhere. You probably have heard how often and fast rabbits can breed. While they make beloved pets, cute little bunnies are also considered pests. The common rabbit, also called the European rabbit, are identified by their upright ears and long, jumping gait. Most of them appear a sandy color or gray-brown, but can be as dark as black. They may look adorable and harmless, but rabbits are a huge threat to biodiversity in areas where they are not native. Rabbits are foragers, and frequent foraging causes soil erosion and loss of land where vegetation could have grown. They are native to Europe and Africa, where their populations are rapidly decreasing to the point that the IUCN placed them on the red list of endangered species. 5. The Nile native. The Nile perch is a freshwater fish that came from the waters of the Nile, Congo, Niger, Lake Chad, and other areas in the Afrotropic zone. Sometimes people call them the African snook or Victoria perch. Because of their size and abundance, these fish are considered a substantial economic and food security item in East Africa. They were introduced to Lake Victoria and the artificial Lake Nasser in the 1950s to boost the fishing industry in those areas. While there was an economic boom, it backfired as much of the native fish went extinct as a result of this invasive species taking over. 4. Vines in the air. This next one is not an animal, but it is worth mentioning. How much damage can a plant do by just existing? Let's look at the kudzu vine for answers. This plant is native to the subtropical and temperate regions of China, Korea, and Japan. They were later brought to warm European countries such as Italy and Switzerland. Kudzu vines have tendrils that can attach to structures, helping them spread along any surface quickly. While they can fix atmospheric nitrogen by supplying 95% of leaf nitrogen to poor plant soils, their presence can be harmful to certain types of plants. On top of that, All the extra nitrogen oxide they pump into the atmosphere spells trouble for the creation of ozone, leading to air pollution. 3. The Argentine black and white tegu. Owning a pet lizard isn't like owning a dog, at least in the case for most lizards. However, the Argentine black and white tegu has a high intelligence level. You can even train them to be housebroken. They are omnivorous and can eat a variety of foods such as fruits, eggs, veggies, and even cat or dog food. These reptiles originally inhabited the forests and deserts of eastern and central South America. Like a few other animals on this list, they made Florida their new home. In this southern state, tegus dig into the nests of turtles and alligators and eat the eggs, causing damage to reptile populations. 2. The hammerhead. Nope, not the hammerhead shark, but the worm. Worms are often used as bait for fish, and as creepy as they look, humans don't pay them much mind. The hammerhead worm, however, is giant for a planarian, the family of earthworms. They are predatory as well and may feed on other annelids or mollusks. The hammerhead likes to track its prey and then uses its sticky secretions and muscles to attach itself to its food to prevent escape. Earthworms are essential to the growth of many plants, and with the rise of hammerheads, it could spell trouble for the ecological health of the environment, particularly in Texas, where hammerheads eat so many fellow earthworms. Hammerhead worms originated in Southeast Asia and were brought to the US around 1901 via horticultural plants. Before we reveal number 1, we have a question for you. Are you an animal lover, or would you rather creatures, domesticated and wild, stay far away from you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. 1. Watch out, birds. When the brown tree snake is near, every avian around needs to head for the sky. This invasive species has wreaked a lot of havoc on the birds native to Guam. Because these snakes are arboreal, they are always near birds in the trees. You can put 2 and 2 together. Brown tree snakes also like to snack on lizards, bats, and small rodents. Native to Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, they were transported by accident to Guam as stowaways on a ship in the 1950s. They didn't just make a dent to the bird count either. The introduction of the brown tree snake caused the extinction of a few local species, as well as thousands of power outages, loss of pets, and even a
Like the Bradford pear, the mimosa is not native to the United States. After being brought to this country, it became an invasive species over the decades. Mimosas line many areas of Chattanooga's landscape with their large leaves and pink flowers.
It's an attractive tree, has feathery foliage, has a very fragrant, attractive flower. What's not to like about it?
They've been here for a long time, and for city forester Gene Hyde, they even bring back childhood memories.
I can remember my grandparents having one of these trees in their yard back in the early 1950s.
But they also have an ugly side.
It's a very invasive tree that takes over native ecosystems. It crowds out the native foliage, the native plants and vegetation.
Their shade blocks nutrients produced by sunlight. These trees are tough. Their seeds spread quickly and for long distances. Also, mimosas can remain fertile even during long droughts, and they can handle extremely cold weather. Hyde says that some animals don't stand a chance where mimosas have taken over.
All of a sudden, they don't have that food source anymore. Neither they get displaced, they leave, or they die.
The mimosa is native to parts of Asia where controls might have been in place to manage its population. This didn't happen after arriving in the U.S., and nature itself hasn't been much help.
There's not a whole lot of other things that predate against it, feed on it, or keep that population under control, and it just goes wild.
There's not enough manpower to get rid of all the mimosas, but Hyde says you can help the problem by not planting them at home.
Be a good steward of your yard, of your property, and think about those native ecosystems. Please don't do it.
For more information on mimosa trees, look for this story inside the WRCB app. In Hamilton County, I'm meteorologist Nick Austin, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
Eradicating a species might sound like something that's always bad. We put a lot of time and money into protecting life on Earth, not destroying it. But not all eradication plans target a species' entire population, just the parts that end up in places we don't want them to be. Invasive species can completely wreck an ecosystem, and we've tried all kinds of different ways to get rid of them over the years. But some of those efforts kind of backfired. Spectacularly. Take, for example, Australia's poster child for invasive species, the cane toad. Native to southern and Central America, this toad is huge, averaging between 12 and 15 centimeters, and will eat almost anything, from carrion to insects to that bowl of cat food you left outside. They'll also eat smaller frogs and toads, snakes, snails, and small mammals. Basically, if it fits in the toad's mouth and it can catch it, it'll eat it. Maybe the saddest part of the cane toad story is that they were introduced to Australia on purpose. Farmers brought them in the 1930s to control the beetles eating their sugarcane crops. Unfortunately, the toads didn't stay in the sugarcane fields and started spreading across the continent. In their native environment, the toads are eaten by local fish, reptiles, birds, and bugs, but in Australia, there are few predators that can eat them safely. Cane toads are poisonous, and predators not adapted to their poison often die after eating them. The toads can also spray poison from glands on their shoulders, which can cause intense pain and temporary blindness in humans, making it both difficult and unpleasant to catch them. And when it comes to breeding, they're like warty hopping tribbles. Females lay clutches of up to 35,000 eggs at a time and can lay 2 clutches a year. Even though less than 1% of the eggs make it to maturity, that's still a huge number of baby toads to deal with. Add all of this together, and it's not hard to see why estimates put the number of cane toads in Australia in the hundreds of millions. And despite efforts to control them, they're spreading, moving into 40 to 60 kilometers worth of new territory every year. But there may be some hope for killing off the toads in one of Australia's native species, meat ants. These little guys can kill and eat toads without being affected by their poison, and since the toads aren't native to Australia, they don't know to watch out for the ants. If scientists can encourage meat ants to colonize places where the toads like to hang out, it's possible they could make an impact on the toad population. Some people have also considered bringing in some of the toad's natural predators, but that's a risky proposition considering importing non-native predators is what got Australia into this mess in the first place. The same control problems have happened with other invasive species too. During the age of colonization, ships carrying explorers often brought along stowaways like mice and rats. So to control them, sailors often introduced foreign predators to take care of the pests. You know the phrase, 2 wrongs don't make a right? That's super applicable here. One popular import was the small Indian mongoose, a voracious predator that was introduced throughout the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, Japan, and the Mediterranean to control invasive rodent and native snake populations. The mongoose was a favorite because it will eat practically anything it can catch, and anyone familiar with Rikki-Tikki-Tavi knows that a mongoose can catch just about anything. That ability was a problem though, because besides invasive rodents, they'll also eat plants, fruit, and eggs, making them a nightmare for native wildlife. The mongoose is credited with the extinction of nearly a dozen species across the globe, which was really not what the explorers who introduced them had in mind. And they carry rabies, in case you needed another reason to wonder why we ever thought introducing them everywhere was a good idea. Obviously, it's best to just avoid introducing foreign species in the first place, but it is possible to eradicate them if you're really dedicated. What happened on Macquarie Island, halfway between Australia and Antarctica, gives you some idea of just how difficult eradication can be, but maybe also some hope. When the island was discovered by an Australian explorer in 1810, it became a hub for seal and penguin hunting. Ships full of hunters brought along mice and rats, which threatened their food stores, so sailors brought in cats to control the rodents. Fast forward 60 years, when another foreign species was introduced, the rabbit. It was an old tradition meant to provide sailors with food in case a shipwreck stranded them on a deserted island. Of course, rabbits multiply incredibly fast, and with lots of tasty rabbits around, the cats multiplied too. By 1970, there were more than 100,000 rabbits decimating Macquarie Island's plant life, and the cats had hunted 2 species of birds to extinction. Conservationists were so concerned about the rabbit problem that they introduced yet another foreigner to the party, a rabbit disease called myxomatosis. It was fairly successful, reducing the rabbit population to less than 20,000 within a decade. But with fewer rabbits to hunt, the cats became even more dangerous to Macquarie's native bird population. By 1985, they'd done enough damage that conservationists began a campaign to shoot and kill all the cats. You can probably guess where this is going. In 2000, the last cat on Macquarie was shot, and in less than a decade, the rabbit population was so out of control they'd stripped nearly half the island bare. To prevent even more damage, the Tasmanian government approved a $17 million program to hunt down and kill every rabbit, mouse, and rat on the island. The first wave of the project kicked off in 2011, spreading poisoned rodent bait all over the landscape. That killed off the rats, mice, and many of the rabbits. Then, to kill off the remaining rabbits, they brought in the dogs. Before you facepalm too hard, the dogs were specially trained rabbit hunters that left the island with their trainers. In April of 2014, after 2 centuries of damage, the eradication was complete. So there might be hope for controlling some of the other invasive species causing problems all over the world. But what's happened in cases like these has taught us a lot about just how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive those efforts can be, and how badly they can backfire. So next time you hear a story about unwanted pets being dumped into sewers, think less mutant ninjas and more ecological nightmare. Thanks for watching.
Though often viewed with fear and dread, are peaceful creatures that play a vital role in the environment. but nearly a dozen species have been struck by a mysterious disease that's already killed millions of these ecologically important animals.
In a laboratory at Western Michigan University, Dr. Martin Von Hoff is working to stop the spread of a plague. Dr. Von Hoff isn't a physician, he's an evolutionary biologist, and his patients are a little unusual.
We have bats that we are artificially hibernating in our lab. These bats have been exposed to the fungus that causes white nose syndrome.
White nose syndrome is a disease caused by a fungus that thrives in cool, humid environments, like in the very places some species of bats love to hibernate. White nose syndrome was first discovered in 2006 near Albany, New York, and since its discovery, it spread to 25 states and 5 Canadian provinces.
It's of great concern. Millions of bats have died. The last estimate was over 6 million bats have died here in North America. And this has very important consequences for the long-term health of bat populations and, subsequently then, because bats interact with other organisms, long-term impacts for the health of our environment.
Ground zero for battling the disease is now Michigan, as the threat rapidly spreads westward. Dr. Alan Kurta and his team from Eastern Michigan University are leading a coalition of biologists, researchers, and experts from around the country. They're guiding fellow bat specialists to the remote regions of Michigan in a frantic search for a method to slow down, if not eradicate, the fungus.
Pretty much since about 2008, we've been looking for the presence of the disease. We did not find any evidence until 2014.
Just this spring, Kurta and his colleagues found signs of the fungus here at Tippy Dam in northwest Michigan, making it a newly infected site. The fungus that causes white nose syndrome is insidious. It cannot infect humans, house pets, or livestock, but it kills nearly every bat it infects. The fungus attacks the exposed skin on their noses, ears, and wings. Irritated by the fungus growing into their skin, the bats arouse from hibernation, and then their problems really begin.
No hibernating animal hibernates the entire winter through. They arouse periodically. Doing that costs a large amount of energy, and the only energy they have is what fat they stored during the autumn. Infected bats are using up their fat much more frequently, and in infected areas, the bats are running out come February, come March, and there's still a lot of snow on the ground. There are no flying insects, so there is no food. The bats are dying of starvation and other complications.
Joseph Hoyt, a graduate student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, is braving a Great Lakes winter as part of the Michigan-led coalition. In the abandoned copper and iron mines of Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Hoyt is spearheading a novel study to determine how different species of bats might spread white nose syndrome between each other.
We're studying the contact patterns of bats, and the way that we do this is by using a fluorescent traceable dust. The dust is applied to the bats at the beginning of hibernation. We then return at the end of hibernation, and we can trace that dust through the colonies of bats. As we kind of move into the western U.S., I think as much information on which species are kind of important, playing important roles in transmitting white nose syndrome will be helpful in determining kind of where future management will happen and definitely deploying future control agents.
And that brings us back to Dr. Von Hoff.
Can we control white nose syndrome? I think that for us is the holy grail for anybody interested in the conservation of bats.
White nose syndrome was first discovered 9 years ago, but no progress has been made in slowing down the disease or limiting its effect. So Von Hoff has turned to an unlikely and natural source of inspiration.
Chitosan occurs naturally in the hard bodies, the exoskeletons of arthropods, and that includes insects and it includes crustaceans such as shrimp and crabs and lobster. It's completely biodegradable, biocompatible. It also has a very important function in wound healing. We know from our own lab tests that if we grow the fungus that causes white nose syndrome in a plate that contains chitosan, we almost completely inhibit its germination. And if it has already germinated, we inhibit its growth by approximately 84%.
Although chitosan has been shown to be effective in the lab, trying it on bats in the field is still some time off. Regardless of when field trials begin, the fight against white nose syndrome isn't just professional for these researchers, it's personal.
Within the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to expect 90% of our hibernating bats to be dead, 250 to 300,000 bats. That's going to be very difficult. I've spent 35 years with these animals, and it will be hard not to have them around.
I guess we've all had to harden our hearts a little bit. You know, as somebody who loves bats, who studies bats for his entire career, you know, it's devastating, absolutely devastating.
Invasive species come in many forms and are a complex and difficult problem. Mitigating the damage they cause won't be easy, but it is achievable as long as everyone does their part. Invasive species. It may sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but they're very real.
There's two main types of invasive species. One would be a native, and the other would be an exotic. Exotic invasives are the ones that come from someplace else, get inoculated into an area because we've planted them or introduced them somehow, and then eventually just keep growing so much that they start shoving out other species. We want to maintain biodiversity. The exotics make things look more homogeneous.
In South Florida, giant African snails have become a major concern.
The biggest snail we found here, it was close to 7 inches.
The snails threaten native species because of their voracious appetite. They feast on at least 500 plant species and their ability to rapidly reproduce.
In September 2014, only in one house we found more than 4,000 snails.
They also pose a threat to people.
The human and animal health threat has been confirmed by the CDC, the presence of Angiostrongylus cantonensis, which can lead to a very rare form of meningitis, and there is no cure for that.
Often it's animals that get people's attention. Invasive species like Nile monitor lizards, Burmese pythons, and lionfish are well known to many Floridians. But even benign-looking plants can pose serious threats to our native ecosystems.
This plant right here is Brazilian pepper. It's in among some other trees, oaks, etc. I'm not touching it on purpose because I might react very much like people would react with poison ivy. This is on the edge of a wetland, and it's a rather nice cypress dome. I'm thinking it's a beautiful wetland. The problem is that Brazilian pepper grows well on the edge of those wet soils, and eventually will crowd out a lot of the other plants here and take over this space. Also notice that it's a fairly empty zone right here. That might very well be to the chemical rain that comes down from this plant that inhibits other plants.
The Brazilian pepper tree was brought to the U.S. as a nursery plant in the 19th century. But it long ago escaped backyards and has thrived in Central Florida.
It's over 700,000 acres, probably more like 750,000 acres now, that is occupied by Brazilian pepper. And that's very comparable to the combined 2 counties of Orange and Seminole counties.
As with many invasives, eradicating Brazilian pepper is a difficult task.
To get rid of this means you have to come in here and cut this, probably drag those branches out of here, very carefully closed so you're not breaking out in a rash from this chemical. But then it usually requires some follow-up because it can re-sprout. And so one of the things that people will do is to treat that stump with a chemical. That requires some training and some permits because you can't necessarily just spray the stuff into a wetland.
Prevention is often a much cheaper alternative, but it requires the effort of many individuals.
The average homeowner can just think about the kinds of plants that they might be planting in the yard, the ones that would grow too fast and spread too far. We can think about it in terms of the animals that we choose to own as pets. We can think about what we do with those animals when we're tired of feeding these large things.
Invasive species can have a significant economic impact, especially when they threaten agricultural products. But they threaten something even more precious to many Floridians.
We need to think about what do we want our world to look like? And how much do we have responsibility for that world? We have to think about how much are we wishing to retain some of the things that we found valuable when we first started thinking about moving to Florida or when we had families that grew up here. The things that make Florida different from other parts of the world will be kind of smudged and erased by invasive species from lots of other parts of the world that show up here. And so we will lose this unique corner of the world. That should matter to us, fundamentally.
Top 10 Archive. An invasive species can be anything from plant, animal, or fungus that is introduced into a non-native habitat and has a tendency to spread to a degree that causes damage throughout the environment, human health, or economy. In this installment, we're taking a look at 10 devastating invasive species introduced by man. Number 10. Zebra mussel. Small yet plentiful, the zebra mussel doesn't just attach themselves to objects, they cover them. The females of these species produce between 100,000 to 500,000 eggs per year each. Native to Eastern Europe and Western Russia, they've been brought to the Great Lakes in the United States in the ballast water of ships. Though they do impede other wildlife in the area, they are an especially costly problem for surrounding cities, as the mussels clog water intakes of power plants. Number 9. Burmese python. Native throughout Southeast Asia, the Burmese python has exploded throughout southern Florida. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, approximately 99,000 Burmese pythons were imported to the United States between 1996 and 2006. Large and hungry, the python have been known to make a meal of a variety of creatures, both mammal and amphibian. With no known natural predator on the western side of the globe, they go largely unchecked and have developed a nasty habit of eating small pets. Number 8. Black rat. Known commonly as the ship rat, this creature is directly responsible or has greatly contributed to the extinction of a vast number of species, especially on smaller islands. The ship rat is most commonly identified with large declines of bird populations and has been moved around to non-native areas since man has been sailing the oceans. They don't just stop there, however. Any species of animal that is similar in weight or size are most vulnerable to becoming their prey. Number 7. European rabbit. Sure, they're cute and fluffy, but they can also be large pests. The European rabbit, also called the common rabbit, has exploded in population pretty much across the globe. With their tendency to overpopulate, these little field-grazing hellions are nearly impossible to keep in check. Just to give you an example, the population of common rabbit in Australia, which is large, is due to just 24 rabbits that an English farmer brought over back in 1859. Number 6. Northern snakehead fish. The northern snakehead fish originally comes from China, Korea, and Russia, and has since made its way over to North America, where the fish outcompetes the native species for food. Though still new and not completely established, the northern snakehead has already begun impacting the ecosystem, as they will eat anything from other fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and even mammals that venture into their territory. Number 5. Nile perch. If you haven't guessed it, the Nile perch is native to the freshwater lake and river systems throughout Africa. However, the perch was introduced in the 1950s into one of Africa's Great Lakes, Lake Victoria, and the ecosystem of the lake was in no way prepared. The perch population boomed in the late 1980s and have since wrought havoc to the various fish and other aquatic wildlife in the area. Number 4. Asian tiger mosquito. As the name implies, the Asian tiger mosquito is native to parts of Asia, but in 1985 they were found in staggering numbers in Texas and were believed to have been brought over as dormant eggs in cargo shipments. As with all invasive species, the Asian tiger mosquito has outshone the local mosquitoes native to the United States. The major problem they bring is the ability to spread great diseases, such as dengue fever and eastern equine encephalitis, something native species weren't known to carry. Number 3. Cane toad. Not all invasive species are introduced to their new environments by accident. In the case of the cane toad, it was brought in to handle crop-eating pests. Well, the toads did their job a little too well, causing them to become the new pests. Native to South and Central America, the toad was distributed throughout Hawaii and parts of the Caribbean and the Philippines to protect sugarcane fields. Not just dangerous to local wildlife, the cane toad secretes a toxin strong enough to kill young children and those with weak immune systems. Number 2. Africanized honeybees, or killer bees. Africanized honeybees, commonly known as the killer bee, are a cross between the African honeybee, Apis mellifera scutellata, and various types of European honeybees, such as Apis mellifera ligustica and Apis mellifera iberiensis. Some of the bees escaped the grounds and began breeding with the local Brazilian honeybees, quickly spiking their numbers and range throughout South and Central America. Highly aggressive, the killer bee gets its name due to the way it attacks anything that strays into its perceived territory, To date, the accidental release of these bees have been responsible for 1,000 human deaths and are virtually impossible to stop, as species are able to interbreed with each other and create new deadly hybrids. That is, until you see number one. Number 1. Killer hornets. Though not as dangerous to man as people like to imagine, the Asian killer hornet is far more dangerous to indigenous bee species. Though not worldwide yet, they have made their way from Japan to China and even parts of France. These large hornets survive by eating the larvae of honeybees. As if there isn't enough of a problem with our bee population dying off, just 4 of these hornets are capable of wiping out an entire colony of honeybees.
It's so important for everyone to know about invasive species because it affects everyone. We want to be able to take our kids to national parks and see beautiful landscapes and not a sea of sweet clover and bittersweet and cattail. I'm Laura Thompson, biotech at Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, and I love to remove invasive species from natural habitats. This is yellow sweet clover, really pretty yellow plant, but it's a non-native invasive species, and we want to pull it out of nice habitats like this to get rid of it before it gets rid of all the native species in this area. With the park having so many edges with railroads and roads, we have a lot of areas that are really easily infested because they're disturbed areas.
Oriental bittersweet in particular is very bad because it can take trees that are century old and grow up to the top of them.
You can see the kind of harm these plants do to the tree, and it just girdles it, and that's one way they'll kill the tree is girdling it.
It's a garden plant, and in gardens they look nice. But out here, it can literally pull trees down, and if unchecked, 50 years from now, we're not going to have any tall trees. They're all going to be on the ground, covered with bittersweet. I know it takes me an hour to clear out one tree when it's heavily infested. But then I've saved that tree for another 10, 15, 20 years.
I am so passionately in love with this area. I've seen what invasives do to these great native habitats. I want to make every part of my day to prevent these areas from disappearing.
My name's Steve Yancho. I'm Chief of Natural Resources at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. It's interesting that USGS has described us as the poster child of invasive species. These are some real nasty players right here. This is spotted knapweed. It's one of those plants that tends to exclude other plants once it comes in, and so the biodiversity is missing. It's no longer there. And when everything's in balance, everything tends to work. When things come into this system, such as a non-native plant, they're in here without the checks and balances that the native vegetation has, and so they just go hog wild. This plant right here is pitcher's thistle. We have to try and maintain this habitat since this is one of the last real strongholds for this plant in this dune system here. This plant really relies on the fact that the sands move. So if the sands don't move, these seed heads don't get buried very easily. When you have things like baby's breath, spotted knapweed, or a lot of vegetation that normally is in here, they tend to lock the sand down. The sand doesn't move. the pitcher's thistle plant is going to be a loser. It's going to eventually drop out of the system. A lot of the dune plants are very fragile. Here's some beach pea right in front of us here. It's a plant that's become accustomed to this open beach environment.
This is black locust. It's a species of tree that is not native to our area of the country. It's a highly invasive plant that actually has a negative impact on the native plants.
Every time the trailer goes off that we've loaded, like, oh, we just did that. It's a good feeling. I mean, we can't do a lot, but we can do a little. I guess that equals a lot in the end.
People don't intend to move invasive plants from place to place. They just happen to be stuck in their bootlaces or in the treads of their boots while they're walking along. And so the biggest way to stop the spread of invasive species would be cleaning your boots, cleaning your gear. Anytime you're leaving an area that may be infested or before you enter a new natural area.
One person can make a difference. One step at a time, you can change the world.